Today I'm sitting down with Meta Prime, a writer and online network builder I originally came across on Substack. Now, Meta is my first online personality that I'm having a conversation with at Going Direct, but the reason why is he penned an essay a few months back called The Necessity of Rebuilding the Social Structure in America. And he hit really at the core reason why I started Going Direct.
Social structure, it's a group of people who understand they have a mutual shared interest, right? They live in close proximity. That's why local communities are such a good example of this.
If we want to rebuild our social structure in America, it all starts with decentralizing the real economy and becoming more connected to the products that we buy through people we make them.
You had a lot of people who were kind of chasing economic success and wasn't consciously understood by the people making that decision is, sure, you're getting this economic advantage, but you're trading it at the cost of you're leaving your community, right? You're kind of ripping apart the social structure.
I hope you enjoy the conversation. We dig into his essay and his broader work with the Meta Prime project, and we also discuss how it relates to Going Direct. Hey, my friends, Jordan here. Just a few words before we hop into today's episode. First and foremost, a sincere thank you and appreciation for all of our early listeners, readers, and supporters at Going Direct. It's really what keeps me going to do this each and every week because there's clearly a community of folks out there looking to build a Going Direct economy, which gets me super excited. Secondly, if you haven't subscribed, please do so. Our main channel and community is forming over on Substack. The link is in the show notes below. And we'll also be putting out our weekly conversations at YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. I hope you all have a great day. And remember to go direct. All right. We are here with Meta Prime. How you doing today, my man?
Yeah, I'm doing great. How about yourself?
Good, thanks. Well, we're recording. It's January 8th, just after the new year, and this is my first conversation with an online personality. We're gonna get into that whole aspect today, but I want to start here just to frame everything up for the audience, which is, I've been following your writing for a while, and the whole kind of premise behind Going Direct and why I felt compelled to do this is the whole idea of we need to build a more decentralized real economy, and we need to start making the products closer to where they're actually being consumed, so we know who makes them, where they come from, et cetera, et cetera. And as someone coming from Detroit, I always thought that's a big part of community and social structures. And the only way we can, I think a big reason why we've lost a lot of our social structure is because we have all these middlemen, and we have a highly financialized economic system that stands in between. And I think when you wrote your piece, which is a big piece of what we're going to discuss today about the necessity for rebuilding social structure, thank you, by the way. It just ignited me at this core, very visceral reason of why I'm doing Going Direct. Most people would look at it through the lens of entrepreneurship and investing, but it's actually about this social structure piece. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I think that really it's about kind of shifting people's attention, away from kind of this hyper economized, very transactional way that they relate to the world, and helping them realize there is this whole way of exchange that's through social capital, that's through connection, that's through network, to move people away from hyper individualism towards kind of an appreciation for group structure, collaboration, all the things that can be achieved there. So it is always really exciting to connect with other people who are kind of on that wavelength, because I think a lot of us are coming to very similar conclusions, maybe from slightly different angles, slightly different language. And it was always really exciting when you put something out there and other people see the value in that and they get excited about it. And, I think we're definitely at a pivotal turning point where you have a lot of the people who are appreciating this kind of social network, social cohesion, connection, and they're all coming together and starting to kind of find each other and find opportunities to synergize and work together and really build this thing that we're all kind of envisioning.
No, totally agree. And I think that's a good segue. I just want to read a part of the passage of your essay because I think it's a good jumping off point. Is that cool? Okay. So this is a little bit lengthy, but I think it's really important for the audience to hear it. So this is directly
Sounds good.
from Meta's recent piece. While the plethora of problems besetting our modern world is fairly well understood, there is little discussion of the source of these problems, let alone actionable solutions for solving them. There are many who would point to corrupt politicians, greedy merchants, or self obsessed social activists, but the simple fact that people like this are allowed to operate is cause for reflection. How did society become so weak that evil like this has been allowed to thrive? The answer can be found in the breakdown of the American social structure. We have effectively become little more than individual consumers floating through a world of economic convenience with little connection to our neighbors and sometimes even to our immediate family. If we want to have any hope of building a better future for ourselves and future generations of Americans, it is essential that we rebuild the social structure necessary to work cohesively. Can you just talk a little bit about like when did this all kind of click for you and that gave you this inspiration to write this piece?
Yeah, so I've been writing since for the Meta Prime project for since about like late 2021, and it's very interesting because every time I write, and I kind of go a little bit back to what got me interested, what were the initial things that I was working on. There's these running themes, and again, they've evolved over time. So initially, what got me writing was I think a lot of us, we look at the modern world, we see all of these problems, we get frustrated by it. We're looking for solutions or a way of understanding. And it's very easy to get hyperfixated on, here's all the reasons these things are wrong and, why they're bad, and, trying to find some kind of transcendent truth, or maybe it'll all click, or we get hyper focused on kind of the big picture kind of conspiracy stuff. And it's a lot of this it's not only a distraction, but like even if you knew what the truth was, or how things have really gotten this bad, it's like the question is, what do you actually do about it? What is the solution, right? Getting past being mad at the situation, and while articulating the problem is a necessary part of fixing it, if you don't move on to the fixing it phase, if you're kind of perennially stuck in this kind of like frustration, as justified as it might be, nothing is going to get done, right? And so a lot of my early writing was encouraging people to say, hey, here's a path, here's a productive path for what you can do. And I think the thing that's usually difficult and kind of keeps people from just kind of this obvious path of like work on yourself, improve, get stronger, but also, reach out, network, and then build these, what I call like parallel systems or like parallel movement, kind of the creation of alternative systems that, give you more independence, give you more bargaining power, give you this ability to kind of do your own thing and not be as reliant on the system, because the system will incentivize you to act certain ways. You have to be economically locked in. But the thing that keeps people from that is a lot of the work to do that is very unglamorous. It's very, it's local, it's small, it's, the people immediately around you or the people online. And a lot of people, when they get online, they kind of get stuck into these very like grandiose, big plan, or, you got to be part of some giant movement, and it can also be very parasocial in the sense that like people kind of feed off these like LARPs, these power fantasies, these like, ideas of they're part of like some great thing that's going to like completely upend everything. Right. And the real answer in my mind is, you have to start local. You have to, what is actionable, what is practical, and kind of accepting that, it's going to take time. It's going to take effort. It's not going to be immediate. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be, glamorous in the same way that like, posting bangers online or whatever is like, can be kind of like a dopamine rush. So this article specifically on the necessity of social structure, I've been networking, in the space for a long time, trying to find other people who are on this wavelength, because I believe that the best way to go about this is to find the people who already kind of get this, whether they think about it, however they think about it, they're trying to create alternatives. And by virtue of the fact that they are, doing actionable, positive, creative things, they're kind of self-selecting for, a fairly high quality of person. And so if you can bring those people together and not focus so much on doing things as much as it is just connecting people and building good trust and cohesion, there's a lot of good stuff that could come from that. And in that experience, I kept running into these different problems where I would see other people try to build stuff, and I'd say like, oh, okay, you're trying to build too fast, or you're focusing too much on achievement versus like group cohesion. And I'd gone to an event out, in my neck of the woods out in the Pacific Northwest, northern Idaho, Cascadia region. And we'd done a camping trip with a bunch of guys, and a bunch of guys who I respect, they're doing some good stuff too. They're building, community groups, and we were kind of talking through all of these problems. And so for me, this article was an attempt to kind of codify a lot of that learning, because a lot of how I see my writing is trying to write for like my younger self, right? Like things that I wish I knew that, hopefully have value, like I feel like they have value to me now, and hopefully they'll have value to other people who are on that path. So that was the real impetus. It was like a lot of people get stuck on the problems. They're not really focusing on the solutions. In my mind, the solution is networking, building these relationships, doing those things. But we're in a very unique time, regardless of the fact that like maybe building relationships isn't like a new thing. Building relationships from a place where, the country is so atomized, people don't have these connections, but also like, how do you do that where we have the rise of digital media? And so there's a lot of nuance to the situation that we're in now. And so the article, in large part, is an attempt to codify some like best practices, some awareness of these issues, with the hope that other people can read that. And even if they're not, networking with me or getting involved in the meta network and what we're trying to do, they're able to more effectively build whatever they're trying to build. And I think that's just a broad win, the more people we have doing that.
So can you just explain, when you say social structure, what is the social structure?
Yeah, so this is like an interesting thing, right? Because one of the ways that I think about social structure is that it's kind of like an ecosystem, in the sense that there's all of these invisible ways in which healthy social structure helps balance things or incentivize, behavior that we want to see that isn't immediately obvious. So, for example, like dating. If you had a small town where, families have been for a long time, and, two people meet, pretty common that, their families are going to know each other, or, they're friends, they're going to have friends in common. And if it's a good match, those families, those friends are going to encourage that, right? They're going to support that. But also once they start dating, right, everyone kind of picks up on this, they know. And so now, no one's trying to approach them because they're like a couple, right? And then if they get into a fight, and say the girl goes off and she goes and talks to her family or friends, modern day, it's very common for, the friends don't know, the family don't know the guy. And so they're going to say, oh, they're going to immediately take her side. They're going to, comfort her and tell her like, oh, he's probably a horrible, whereas if they all know each other, right, they have an incentive to kind of encourage, the reconciliation and keeping the relationship together. And they probably can kind of like help navigate that a little bit better. And so when I think of like healthy social structure, what I'm thinking about is it's a group of people who understand they have a mutual shared interest, right? They live in close proximity, right? That's why like local communities are such a good example of this. And part of the reason everything's fallen apart as much as it has is because we just don't have the same kind of consistency of living in the same spot. To talk a little bit about this in the article, but you had a lot of people who were kind of chasing economic success because they knew that, hey, I can go to college in another area, I can get a job in the city, and I'm going to be making, 2-3 times what I would, in the town, right? Or, have access to all these cool things like, food and entertainment and adventure. And what wasn't consciously understood by the people making that decision is, sure, you're getting this economic advantage, but you're trading at the cost of you're leaving your community, right? You're kind of ripping apart the social structure that exists in these small communities. And again, it's not a conscious thing. It's not an active thing. It's not so much even a visible thing. But now we're kind of experiencing a lot of the downstream effects of this broken down social structure. We look at like dating, or we look at like how the boomers act, even is something I would kind of attribute to bad social structure, because they have all of these economic alternatives for like hospice care and all of these other things where they don't need their family. They don't need those connections. So they have no incentive to invest in it, right? Whereas if the social structure was healthy and what we primarily relied on, the older generations would say, hey, look, like my family's going to take care of me in my old age. I have a strong incentive to make sure that they're taken care of, that they have a good life. They're financially successful, but also, I'm passing on not just my knowledge. This is another thing. It's like, you look at a lot of the businesses today that get bought up by VCs, right? The HVAC companies, or the mechanic shops. What are they really buying? They're not necessarily buying like, maybe the place, and they're buying the connection. They're buying the Rolodex. They're buying the reputation. And so all families to some degree have this, right? If you lived in a small town, your parents inevitably have friends, they have connections, they've got all that kind of stuff. Like when you leave, you're forfeiting all of that social connection, that social capital that was built up. And I think that's a large part of what happened is we didn't appreciate or understand what this social cohesion was, the advantage that it gave us. And because we've just been pursuing economic advancement, and we live in a world that's so economically transactional, right? Everything, therapy, romance, obvious things like food and shelter and whatnot, they're all economic exchange. Whereas, the more that we can when those were social exchanges, there were all these other kind of invisible, benefiting kind of balancing elements that naturally incentivized good behavior or long-term valuable behavior. And so we're kind of losing that. So when I think of social structure, I think of like shared cohesion around this common mutually beneficial goal, and kind of this alternative way of like getting things that's much more natural, much more healthy. I don't know. So hopefully that answers the question you were getting at.
No, it does. It hits the core part of where you make the point in the article about replacing natural social structures with economic alternatives. And I think you hit it directly. And man, I have so much to discuss here, because I think there's like, this is heavy, right? What you're talking about is like a really heavy thing. And it's also like uniquely American, right? Where it's like our generation, I remember very specifically, right? I'm from Detroit. So it's like no one even thought generally of like staying home in Detroit at the time of when I was graduating college in 2005, 2006, right? Mm-hmm. It was like there was no opportunity. Detroit had a major problem, which we'll talk about in a minute, with the brain drain and crime, and just like a long series of, in the deindustrialization, like I can go on and on. But, we were raised where it was like, the minute you can get out of there and go to the coasts, go to Chicago, go to where the jobs were. Right. Mm-hmm. And then the talent at that time was going into, the talent generally was going into banking and consulting, and like where these like high profile, highly financialized jobs were. And I was one of them. Mm-hmm. And it was so interesting. So, because I had this like very formative experience where both my parents were sick. A couple of years after school, I was working in San Francisco. I made the decision to go home to Detroit, and I decided to stay. And I got really involved in the community. I started a couple of nonprofits to help bring back kind of local entrepreneurial activity into the city of Detroit. I spent a decade of my life dedicated to this, and then I ended up I started buying commercial real estate and developing real estate in very specific parts of Detroit. And the whole kind of thesis was, can we move back towards a production-oriented economy? So we were building a lot of kind of light industrial workspace for companies making and designing products and stuff like that. And so I got this I made a very concrete decision in my life where I needed to go take some care of things at home. And then I decided to make a unique, like to take a situation that most would look at as like not a positive situation into a positive one. And I was really involved with the resurgence of downtown Detroit. And I think that was a really big formative experience, and why this article that you wrote hit me so hard, and why this is the core of my work, which is I saw that, but I also made this conscious decision to go back into my social structure, to like go do something about it. And I was lucky that there was an economic opportunity aligned with that, which ultimately led to a very fortunate outcome for me from an investment standpoint. But I think my next question on that, though, is like, how do we, in your mind, you go back to what can we do to start kind of reversing that? Because at the end of the day, people are going to go to where the economic opportunity is. That is what America is about. So how do you give us like is there one little area or thing like we need, even with that being the reality of the game on the field, what is something that we can do or we can be mindful of? Because we're still going to go find economic opportunity for ourselves before sacrificing that just for family. Most people will, at least.
No, and I absolutely agree, right? Like this is the challenging thing is I'll tell people like, hey, this is a time where we can be cultivating social capital as opposed to economic capital, right? Because we're immersed in this economic capital system. And people say, well, you still have to make money. And I'm like, yes. I'm not trying to say like, just, be a friends and favor based economy or, something like that. But, this question of like, how do you bridge the gap, right? How do you start something that, is cultivating these, more localized community, social fabric rebuilding initiatives. And I think a big part of this is that what rebuilding social fabric is, in essence, is an understanding and appreciation for the value of strong social fabric as something that can solve these kind of long-term problems, right? But it takes a lot of, especially from the point that we're in now, it's going to take a lot of investment and time and care. And you're going to run into your normal problems of like, you're going to have people who, might seem motivated or interested when, they're talking about it in the digital realm, or they might get on board because it's like a cool thing to be a part of. But then when rubber meets the road, are they actually going to show up? Are they going to work? Are they going to do things, right? That's one of the things I talk about in the article is this constant problem of like failure to launch, perennial discussion kind of, online, terminally online stuff. And so what I found, kind of like directly address your question, is what you're looking for is people who already get it, right? Because you have to have the long-term vision. The way I see it is if you're in the current system, it's very easy to get that immediate gratification, right? It's very easy, if you're competent especially, to just make money because, those opportunities still exist. They're available to you. But if you are going to like invest the time, energy, and effort into rebuilding social structure, you think of like, what are the incentives to do that? Well, the incentives exist very obviously and immediately if you have the ability to look beyond kind of the existing system and realize this is not sustainable. This is not going to work long term. And if I just maximize my short-term value inside the system, I'm just going to, I'm going to stay on the sinking ship. It's the Titanic. Maybe I'm like in the dining room, like eating all the caviar or whatever it is, right? But like, that thing's going under. And so what you want is people who are willing to do the hard, heavy lift of this kind of pioneering, this rebuilding of social structure. And I found that the best way to do that is, again, find people who are already building, because those people already get it, right? They already see the value to the extent that they're willing to take action. And so you don't have to do all of this work corralling people and convincing them. And that's what I try to do with a lot of my articles is like, I'm not trying to necessarily make this so it's people out in the mainstream are seeing this and then joining, right? I'm really trying to find the other people like yourself who already get it, who want to be invested, who want to build, who maybe even done stuff already, and bring those people together, because then those people can share ideas, they can work together on projects. And the other interesting thing about this is, especially in the online space, because of that kind of like LARPy stuff, people can be very puritanical about like, oh, you're not part of our group, right? Like I think that generally people in this sphere, especially like the counterculture kind of build alternative, like maybe roughly has kind of like a right leaning side to it. But, living in the small towns that I have, like I was volunteering at the search and rescue, the last town that I was living in. There's a woman who worked there who probably voted in a different way than I would vote in the ballot box. And I use this example because she was showing up and helping out at the search and rescue and volunteering her time and doing great work. And it was just like, this person is more my ally in what I'm trying to do as far as rebuilding social structure than any of like the most fervent, ideologically agreeable person online who's just terminally online and just doing that. And so that's the other thing. It's like, one, you're looking for quality people. You're looking for people who are at this kind of demonstrated by the virtue of their action and their dedication. And then two, like get over this kind of like binary left-right political distinction. Like the people who are building community, I'm sure in like your efforts to help out in Detroit, like probably ran into a bunch of people who might have been, ideologically different, but they care about the community. And I think that once you kind of put that aside, those as distinctions, and like there is going to be a much more populist movement, in my opinion. And I think that's largely out of necessity. Like people realize and I've never felt like the left or the right was like one side's right, one side's wrong, right? Like it's very much in their most positive incarnations, like, creativity and order, right? Like they need to be there to balance each other out, right? Like empathy, but also, kind of, like a seriousness or whatever kind of like, those juxtaposition of those healthy forces. And so, for me, as far as like getting this thing rolling, it's really about finding people who, by virtue of their actions, care about this stuff, that work on this stuff, and trying to bring them together. And once that alternative is a little bit more solidified and people like see it as something that they can move towards, you're going to get further adoption. And then we're going to have different problems of like, making sure we're not bringing in people who are going to like try to subvert it or change it in their own direction or try to do what they want to do or anything like that. But yeah, I think right now it's about how do you find good quality people, knowing that's going to take time, it's going to be slow, and the filters that certain people put on it just don't make sense.
I think it's a good segue to give a little bit more background. You talked a little bit about it right at the beginning, but I came across you originally through your writing, and as you say, call yourself an online personality. And so, can you just break down like more specifically, or just step back first and just like talk about the Meta Prime project, exactly what that is, and like what you actually do every day?
Yeah, well, so I have like an actual job. So I run my own recruiting consultancy, and so I help people hire and do that kind of stuff. I've been working in tech for a while, and before that, I was a rower and a rowing coach. It's a bit of a history, but basically, what happened was working in tech. I had both really great opportunities where I was working for people who I really liked, who were great mentors. They really like taught me some really insightful, brilliant people. And I was very kind of lucky to be around that. And then I experienced just the worst that the modern, large tech companies have to offer, in the sense that like just completely narcissistic, ignorant middle managers, one of those things where it's like, if you do something because you're honestly trying to help and make things better, and then you end up upsetting a bunch of people and you're like, what went wrong? And you realize like, oh, they don't want people who are going to, upend the system and change it for the better because they're happy with their like little grift or their do nothing middle management job or something like that. And then also, the normal kind of like, straight guy, white guy discrimination stuff,
Sure.
just all of like the modern kind of things. And so for me, it was kind of like realizing, I think the big part of it was, I started out like East Coast, fairly liberal family, listen to NPR. I was kind of a Bernie bro back in like 2016, right? Like, so it wasn't, the funny thing is like, I don't even consider myself like a radical in any sense, right? I'm just like a guy who, my politics around Bernie were like, don't, no government, wasteful government spending, no wars, like take care of people at home. Like it was, like that's still basically my philosophy these days. And So for me, it's like I had earnestly tried to engage with the system, right? I had, kind of bought into the idea that everything was run by functional, adults who really understood things and got it, and so kind of running into that in the business world where, I was like, wow, there's a lot of like incompetence and corruption and nepotism and just ignorance but not on just kind of like little things here and there that kind of like make things just like a little bit more difficult than they need to be, but otherwise it's fine. It's like, you take a like step back and you're like, oh no, there's just parts of society that are just completely going down pain. And so for me, and and everyone had their, their kind of awakening moment, right? Whether that was like elections or, COVID or whatever it was, right? And so what I was trying to do when I first started the Meta Prime project was going through that transition from like being kind of, a normal liberal, kind of like, liberal millennial who wasn't paying too much attention to politics, but really bought into like the, positive, feel good vibes of like, liberal politics, to kind of someone who kind of, started realizing, oh, maybe the media is not saying everything that we want. Maybe corporations are pretty greedy and extractive and, all that kind of stuff. The question is like, how do you go through that experience, that process, in a way where you're not getting like sucked down conspiracy theory rabbit holes or getting hyper fixated on like, oh, the injustice of everything. Like, again, not fixating on the problems, but getting towards the actionable solutions. And so that was like a stressful time. I think another part of it too is like when you're embedded, like the social network that you're a part of, when you think about things in a certain way, it is a bubble in the sense that it's self-reinforcing, right? It's like, even if you don't mean for it to be, it's like the people you talk to, reflect back your worldview usually, or else you kind of move away from it or whatever. And so if you go through like a big shift, like, going from trusting to not trusting the media, for example, or thinking they might have an alternative agenda, like, the people that you can talk to in your network are like, they're much smaller than the normal conversation. So you have to make these big shifts, right? Like you have to be smart about it. You don't want to burn bridges with people, like the people, your friends, family, and whatever, like they're still good people. Like just because they don't see the world you do in the way that you do doesn't mean like, that they're any less like your friends or family, or that you should have those connections. And so all of this to say, that was like a rough transition for me, because like I didn't really know what I was doing. I was like kind of looking for truth. I was you want to find like an authority or something like that, and honestly I don't really think that there's anyone like Jordan Peterson was kind of like nice to have during that time, because he was just like, be responsible, and like that, that's like a pretty transcendently positive like message for people to, it's like, yeah, the world's hard, but like, take on your responsibility. But like, there wasn't too many people who I felt like, had kind of like just a very reasonable, like, yes, the world is crazy, but like focus on what you can control. Like that's a very big part of the Meta Prime project, is what I'm talking about, like framework building. I'm like, look, you don't have to find the capital T truth about how everything works, right? What you need to figure out is what is valuable in your life? What do you actually want? What's going to make you happy? What's going to be meaningful? And then how do you go and do that? And a lot of times it's just as simple as like becoming more competent and friendly and building these local networks and having good relationships with people. Like people get too caught up in a lot of these things. And so what I wanted to do is create like effectively an orientation guide for people who are breaking from the mainstream delusion, as I call it, and kind of trying to find a healthy alternative, and I didn't like, I saw so many people get, like jaded and pessimistic and despondent, or, angry, and just kind of, like having this like kind of toxic rage. And so it was just like you need to create, right? That the first article that I wrote for the Meta Prime project was live not in opposition to evil, but pursuit of good. And it was basically just like a call to say, hey, look, like I get, the kind of very like angsty kind of LARPy fantasy of like, we're going to burn everything down. This is, system's corrupt. Like, fine. Even if you did achieve that, what is going to replace it? Right. Like, we don't have enough people building healthy, positive alternatives. And so that was a lot of what I was trying to do. I wrote that, the 5-step process of the journey,
since then I've written, these kind of articles on more kind of, and to me, again, it's a continuation of a lot of what this is, which is just encouraging people to like be practical, be local. Like there's a path, and it's a good path and it's a viable path. And like, it's going to be meaningful. You're going to meet a lot of really cool people and you're going to invest in something that does have long-term viability. And so, yeah, so that was it for me. It's like, I was an absolute mess trying to like figure everything out. I'm kind of writing for my past self, and hopefully that is helpful to other people. And now that we're kind of working on these solutions, people kind of get that, hey, fraternal networks are something that would be a really powerful way we build going forward. I'm trying to create more language, more understanding around this new domain that we're trying to figure out, such that we can be more effective in kind of this rebuilding of American social fabric.
And so you're talking about the concept of parallel systems. And so when you use this idea of building these parallel systems, which is like breaking away from kind of the mainstream, whatever, it could be an institution, it could be ways and a certain industry works or whatever it is. But when you're talking about parallel systems, we still live in that world, right? So that you still have to exist in that world. So is your kind of thought and kind of what you put out there that when you're building these parallel systems, it's like you can't, like, if you just, like you said, go LARPy and say I'm going to burn the whole thing down and just like disregard the current system, you're going to be sitting out there on an island.
Yep.
So are you encouraging to say how do you straddle both in a way?
Yeah, I mean, this is concept that I've talked about in some of the articles called being a master of both worlds, right? It's like, Jungian hero's journey, kind of Joseph Campbell's kind of stuff, right? Where, yeah, I mean, and it's the same thing as the people where I'm saying, like, we should build more economic or social capital, and people are saying, well, you still have to have economic capital. It's like, yes, definitely. So similarly, like, I'm not, I see people who are like, let's build a community out in the woods or have a cabin or whatever. And it's like, hey, look, if that's what you want to do, and I've said this plenty of times before, it's like there's a lot of different paths that are out there that I don't necessarily agree with, like the best path. But hey, if you want to be the guy who builds the cabin or builds the community apart, like, and you see value in that, like, I'd much rather you go and try and like try to make it happen than like constantly arguing with people if it's viable or if it's not viable, right? But to me, like, the much more practical, way of doing this is to say, hey, like, you can still be a good member of your community, right? Like, you can be someone who, people around town like, and you're helpful and you're friendly and you're, doing stuff. And, you can go to like the block party or the barbecue or, and just interact positively with people. Like, I think that's another thing is a lot of people are like, I see the world differently and I can't like associate with normal people anymore or whatever. It's like, what like planet do you live on? Like, everyone is just, they're fundamentally the same in that they want a good life and they want to have social connection. They want things to be stable, And so for me, it was like, if we can like encourage people to maintain all those healthy, good, normal parts of their life, but also say, like, on top of that, you dedicate a little bit of time of building these alternative systems. And for me, like, the way that I think about it is very simply, everyone who's like listening, if you're listening to this now, or if you read content or whatever, like, you can just start to get to know people a little bit more intentionally in your community. Like, one of the suggestions that I make in the article is become the guy, right? And we all kind of know this concept of the guy who, he's the one who knows everyone. It's like, he knows the mechanic that, your car breaks down, you're talking to him and he's like, yeah, I got my mechanic friend. Like, you should go talk to him. Or like the barber or, the finance dude or whatever. And, honestly, building those connections is not hard. It's like, my car recently broke down a couple months back, and it was like one of the cylinders like gave out. And so I called up one of my friends and I was like, hey, who's like the mechanic guy? And he was like, oh, I think it's this dude. Well, I actually asked a bunch of people and they all said the same guy. Ended up like having him, he did a great job, very fair price. We ended up like chatting for like an hour and a half. Like, he's got a family, he's trying to build his business. Like, he's on that wavelength of like, I care about my community. I want to be better connected. Like that was part of the reason he got recommended, right? He's already kind of like tied in, ingratiating himself. And it's like now going forward, obviously anytime, someone has a car issue, like that's the guy I'm going to recommend, right? And that's kind of how it should be, right? Is you should be connected into a community. You should care about the people. You don't have to like go live in the woods and start subsistence farming and living off the grid, or like that's not kind of what this is about. Ideally, we get to a point where like one of the things that I see more and more is like, there's a lot of regulations around like farming where it's like, oh, you have to get your meat processed at this like, FDA approved or whatever plant. And so you can't, you have to go through all these loopholes, government loopholes, if you're going to like sell, as a farm. And so one of the things that farmers are doing is like, now you can buy a share in the cow, right? And then they don't have to go through all those regulations. You just get the meat directly. And so I think like that's kind of what's happening is people are finding like, hey, if I have local connections, if I know people directly, right, I can, I get my car fixed a little bit faster. I know I'm not going to get jilted, or, I know the farmer and he saves money not having to go through all this stuff. And I trust that he's doing a good job. And yeah. And so for me, it's not this separate society thing. It's just, you're rebuilding the social fabric on top of like the economic structure that exists. And what this ideally is starting to do is, social capital can't be taxed, right? It can't it's like moving into that alternative gives us a huge benefit, but also gives us negotiation power, right? It's like, you can't not eat the processed chemical foods if you don't have the healthy farms around you. But the more kind of energy you're giving them, whether it's social economic capital or whatever, the investment that you're putting in means that's much more like viable, successful alternative, right? And so that's kind of how I see a lot of this is we're kind of waking up to the fact that the completely economized system that we're currently immersed in is just not viable. And building a parallel system, it's not like we can stand one up overnight instantaneously, but we can start building it through these kind of like greater social connections that pick up steam over time and put us in a position where, we have alternatives that are probably, and again, we recapture all of those kind of like ecosystem, natural balance, invisible elements that I was talking about earlier, where it's like, as you start to build that network, reputation becomes a thing. And like having a good reputation is important, which incentivizes people to cooperate and be more honest and trustworthy and, cooperative. And so like, I think it's one of those things where it's like, as that emerges, we're just going to be amazed at all the ways it kind of like fixes a lot of these problems that we're running into today.
Well, I think, you while I was writing a couple notes when you were talking there, and I think, and I think it's this perfect segue into the concept of going direct, right? Because I think this is right. You hit right on where this intersection of kind of your work and your writing intersects with my work and what I'm doing. And I've always said at the very beginning, like the core kind of community and a lot of the folks that I speak to are more like founders and engineers, entrepreneurs that are building technologies or being very intentional about building systems that enable to go direct to bring us closer to the products that we buy and the people that make them. Like and it's like a really, really important thing. And we were talking just before this pod about kind of what you're planning for your next article, which we're going to get into. I think it dovetails perfectly into this. And I'll just give you a perfect example, because I just recorded one. We'll be putting it up in a few weeks. And it's a gentleman, shout out to Oren. He started a company called Area 2 Farms. And so he's a fascinating background. He worked at the NSA for a decade, started a cybersecurity company, had a pretty attractive exit. And then he somehow landed on the local food systems. And so he's literally creating small 5,000 square foot indoor farms, all soil-based. It's all soil-based growing. So it's not hydroponics. It's like very big into the nutrients and flavor. But what he's doing is he basically was like, if you look at a lot of these vertical farming companies, one of the biggest problems they have in most of the industries, which is a separate conversation, is distribution. So most of these vertical farming companies, that none of them worked out, they were still trying to sell their produce or their lettuce through the same distribution model. And that's where everything breaks down because of the middlemen, because of the gatekeeping. You're not going direct. And so what they're doing, like their vision is it's like a modified kind of CSA model where kind of you have a local farmer entrepreneur that runs the indoor farm, and then within, the idea is within a 5 to 10 minute radius of that farm, that's where you serve all the families that you service get all of their vegetables for the week and the produce for the week. And so he's really basically localizing both the production and the distribution in a very, very local way, and vertically integrating that. And the reason why I bring that up is you mentioned it with that concept of like buying the share of the cow and getting it directly from the farmer, right? I am just so shocked. And this is my optimistic view of kind of the side of AI and robotics and technology, but I am just so shocked how people don't connect this breakdown of social structure and loneliness with the fact that we have no connection to the things that we're consuming generally, or the people that make them.
Yeah, you couldn't be any more right. I mean, it's funny. So, came back to the East Coast for the holidays, and I made a point. Like, got a great leather shop that's up in northern Idaho called like Crafts and Lore. Amazing dude. He's been working for like 10 years. Just gorgeous products. Like, so I got a bunch of leather stuff for all the guys, and then there's a great company called Idaho Tallow, and they make soaps and all this other really great stuff. So all the girls in the family got beef tallow soap bars and stuff like that, and they love that stuff. And to me, it's not just like, all right, these are really beautifully made, handcrafted stuff, but it's also like I feel good knowing that whatever money I'm spending on presents is going to like local people in my area. And we'll definitely talk even when we get off the podcast. I would tell you a little bit about some of the other projects that we have going on, because that's a big part of what my goal with the Meta Network is we've got this great fraternity online of all these great guys. They have all these interesting ideas, and guys like yourself who are doing this stuff. And what I want to do is kind of connect them with other people on the same wavelength and kind of help them out, because I think you're absolutely right. We have some ideas floating around of how one of the problems in the space, for example, is you want to network people together. So you want connectivity, but you also want privacy, right? Like, people don't necessarily, if they're part of this space, they have their own views, and they don't want to be accosted by a ton of people. So how do you kind of maximize searchability of a network and accessibility of a network with privacy also as a high priority? Well, the way that I've found as someone who does a lot of networking is referrals, right? It's like, if I know a guy and I know another guy and they both trust me and I like both of them and I know both of them, I can be like, hey, you don't know this other guy, so you don't know anything about him, but I'll selectively share the information that's relevant. I'll endorse him as someone I really think is a great connection, and I'll do the same going the other direction. And then I'll set those guys up and they'll have a conversation, and ideally it goes really well, and then they can go off and synergize and do, other things together. And so how do you do that, in a network? You can use AI to be an intermediary. And then what does that open up if you have a highly searchable yet private network that can do these things? So we've got some ideas around that, but what you're talking about of localized feud distribution, and that's the idea. Is technology. I think another article that I wrote was called "Refuting Techno-Transhumanism," and I'm not a Luddite, but I think that unabashed and unrestrained techno-transhumanism is extremely dangerous. I also think there's a lot of fanciful, misconceptions about what technology can do, and so that's a lot of that that article is trying to be kind of measured, but it's also trying to kind of promote people look, you can use technology synergistically with this kind of healthy, natural way of being, these natural social structures. It's really a matter of modeling the way that the technology operates off how natural, healthy social structures would work. Right. So that example of I'm the referral source, and if we can digitize a similar structure of referral source, right, that's also going to be effective. And so I think what you're talking about with hey, people used to just get their food from the local farm, right? Like, why can't we just go back to that? To your point, like the value of having people who are locally connected and they appreciate that. That's such a game changer, right? And no reason not to use technology to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and that was why, that's what gave me the, like, really gave me the impetus to put out so much time and energy into this, is because about 18 months ago, 24 months ago, I was like, oh, like, I was seeing the tools and the technology starting in like 2023-ish, 2024. I'm like, oh, like, actually AI robotics are going to transform the physical world. And actually what's actually happening right now, and you kind of alluded to this in a different way, which is many of our our old centralized systems, they've just become too sclerotic, and they're, like I said, they're not just aligned with most people's daily lives, right? And I think there's no better, example of, obviously, independent media versus traditional media. That was like the first card to fall, right? And so what this is, if you study just like history, it's always about this idea of like bundling and unbundling, or things centralized or decentralized. And like we're biological systems, right? So like when things are just like get so out of whack, like it's just going to naturally swing back the other way. It always happens, you know? And so this like swing back to decentralization, but I'm also a realist, similar to you, kind of when you talk about these parallel systems. I think about decentralizing the real economy, but I'm pounding the table because I am like a free markets guy and I understand how the markets work, and you have to be they're ruthlessly competitive. That's the reality. So while you and I can say, hey, we want to get our shoes made from the local shoemaker, okay, well, that's probably not going to happen, because you need to be able to have a model that competes on price and convenience at the end of the day at some level, right? And so I'm a realist. I'm like stoic about it, right? But I'm very hopeful that that if we apply the technology the right way, we just have to bring it together with the right business models and incentive structures to enable these more decentralized systems. And the reality is, because the world I come from, which is like when you look at how like institutional investment funds are structured, whether that's on the venture side or private equity side or whatever it is, it's like the incentive structures aren't there to do what a lot of the stuff that you're talking about, which is like, you got to start small. It's going to take time. Like it's a lot of the non-sexy stuff. And that's actually how you build strong foundations to things. So,
yeah. And I think the other exciting part in my mind is that you're absolutely right about the whole, like, it has to be economically viable. Mm-hmm. But the interesting thing is the existing systems, they're so large, they're so kind of stuck on their trajectories of like, exploitation for profit. Think of like healthcare, right? And how the insane rising rates of health insurance, and how like people aren't really getting the care that they need. But also on top of this, like couple it with the fact that a lot of these medical services, right? The big pharma and all of these, they want not for you to be healthy, but to make profit off of you.
Sure.
Right. And so, people are kind of like, there's one of the points that I bring up in the article that I'm writing now is there's two types of people who break from the system, who become disillusioned in how bad things are. The first is just pushed out by necessity, right? It's like you stop paying for health insurance because you can literally not afford to pay for health insurance. The other group is those who have the foresight to see this is unsustainable. It's not going to work. I need to look for alternatives now while I still can, right? While I'm not in a dire situation later where I have to make a last minute ditch switch. And what I see, because, I try to be as aware of these alternative systems that they're growing as possible. There's a huge, like, food is a very obvious one. Like, more people are starting to eat local and organic, and I'm really excited for that. Because the other thing there is, like, if you can, again, I think a lot of times if you get people to look at the more long term, the incentives are there such that you don't need to, like, that they should be doing that thing anyway, right? So it's like short term incentive of like, if you just want to eat delicious, cheap food, yes, you can buy stuff that's really bad for you. If you understand the value of eating, healthy food, and like understand that the extra price that you pay for, locally grown or whatever is price is like that cost is going to be saved in your medical bill or the quality of life, or, it's a worthwhile investment, right? Then, it's an easy sell, right? You can get people on board with that. I think the medical field is another area that this is going to happen. I have one particularly good friend of mine, and I won't give too much detail, but basically he's been doing his own thing for a while now, focusing on more holistic health, more comprehensive medicine, things, finding treatments that are effective. And a lot of times the reason they don't get adopted in the mainstream is because they're cheap. They're cheap and effective. And, big pharma doesn't like that. And he's starting to see a lot of interest and investment. And so to me, I have another buddy who's working on something to do with, peptides and that rising field. So there's all of these alternatives that are coming up that don't necessarily have to be extremely economically competitive in kind of like a 1-to-1 ratio so much as the big systems are just so unsustainable and becoming ineffective in what they're doing. And we have these innovations, and they're going to be a little, it takes some time to get them up and running and get them started, and they're a little bit difficult at the beginning, but the increase in quality and the efficiency is just going to be so much higher. And so very much what like a lot of startups try to do, I feel like we're kind of going through like a shift where it's like, there's these basically like cultural or social startups that are happening that are going to take over like the broken parts that are falling apart now.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're just hitting at the point of, it just kind of goes back to the same thing. That's the market forces at work, right? So like if consumers are just not getting a good experience, or it's getting out of control expensive, and then you give them an alternative one that's better, they're just going to go with the better one. I'll give you an example. So I did an episode of several months ago with Manan Shah. So he's an ENT surgeon and physician, and he created a direct care model for allergy treatment. And so it's kind of like it's sublingual immunotherapy, which basically is like you take a test, whatever you're allergic to, and then you basically put a couple drops under your tongue for it takes, the whole process is like 2 years. But it was a very interesting conversation because, he is a surgeon and goes through like the traditional, healthcare system and reimbursement system. And when they were creating this kind of direct care model, he just said, allergies was one of those things that was just like a really good fit for it because, they do everything telehealth. So people don't have to go in to get their allergy shots every so often. They can do it remotely. And what he was saying is the reimbursement rates and the cost between your deductibles and your copays and everything, if you actually look at the cost now, not only is it more convenient, but it's actually cheaper to go through this therapy, which is also historically more effective, has been used for a long time. And so my point of what I'm saying is I think it's just an example. A lot of times people like to get like very overly intellectual about it, but like it's just very simple. It's like if you have a bad product, it's too expensive, and someone comes along and gives something that's cheaper and better and it works, like people are just going to rotate towards that.
Yeah. And, and it's funny too, because I like this point of like, what's practical, right? Because I think that's another thing that gatekeeps a lot of people out from having these conversations is they're like, we need to do big grandiose plan that's going to like, magically fix everything. And it's like, what I appreciate about being in this space, it's a lot of people who are like, yeah, I understand the world's difficult and weird and making a lot of mistakes, but like, if we're going to fix it, it has to kind of exist on these trajectories, on these dimensions of economic viability and achievability and starting small and all that kind of stuff. And, it filters out, the more
Sure.
kind of head in the cloud people versus the practical ones. But also, and I think this was a point that I was touching a little bit on earlier, is like, how do you start this? Well, you find the people who are already building. Yeah. And I think that that duality between people who get pushed out of the system, not by choice, but by kind of virtue of like, they just couldn't hack it. Like there's a bunch of people who are competent enough, and this is the kicker, they're competent enough to make it into the system, right? It sounded like, it's not like you were like, we need to rebuild social structure because
I can't get a job. You were like, you went home and you saw, what was happening, and you kind of
Sure.
reconnected. And so it's like you're like a competent guy who becomes aware of the problem and looks into the future and says, hey, this isn't good, this isn't sustainable. And so that's really kind of the group of people that I'm trying to find, is the people who are looking at everything and saying like, hey, things are kind of coming apart and this is not going to be good long term. But like, it's not, we're not like accelerationists. We're not like,
Sure.
LARPing is like, post-apocalyptic, barbarian hordes that are going to like wander the plains or whatever. Like we're effectively, I think of it as, that we're going through kind of like a second American ethnogenesis, right? It's like to become an American, like a very big part of this was you had to travel across the sea, you had to pioneer, you had to settle, you had to be entrepreneurial, you had to be independent, right? Like it was these kind of evolutionary filters. I think what's happening now is a second version of that, where it's like, if you're going to be a part of what happens next, you're going to find your way into these kind of rebuilding of social structure. You have to be kind of pronatalism, right? Like you have to have a family, right? If you're not having kids, well, then guess what? You're not going to be part of the future, right?
Sure.
And I think similarly, if there's a contingent of people who maybe are aware of all these problems, they're not really doing anything, or they're not doing anything practical. It's the people who are taking these practical steps that are trying to find a healthy, viable path where they've got one foot in both systems, who are going to make it. And yeah, I'm very excited about it all. I think like, the people that I meet are, because again, they're competent people who see the problems and are practically working on the solutions. They're a lot of fun to talk to. They're cool. They're doing interesting stuff. And you find all these cool little projects. And my thought is, hey, if we can network all of these projects, leaders together, not to say that they have to like be working on each other's projects or whatever,
Sure.
but the shared collaboration, the shared awareness, right? Like I'm making I'm going to be on a call tomorrow with like two guys who, one of them used to work in an industry, another guy's building a business in that industry. He needs someone to do, some compliance consulting work or something like that. So that's going to happen. And, so it's just these little things of like, finding little ways to kind of make it easier for us to all build these things that, and kind of in the different areas that we think are, have value. I'm really excited to be a part of that. And it's something that I think the last thing I'll say about it is there's a lot of quieter voices, people who like lurk online, let's say, who they look at everything and, like, yes, they're frustrated about all the problems and whatnot, but because they've had success inside the system, right, that they've made money, they've built businesses, they've maybe, sold them off or whatever, they're not interested in the aggressive,
Sure.
kind of LARPy aesthetics. They want to find who are the practical people who are building. And so like, I think that's been kind of a part of my content, is never to get caught up in this kind of like making enemies out of like other normal American people who, are just still figuring this out and whatnot. Like it's been to say, hey, let's create like a positive vision. We don't have to like be antagonistic to the bad stuff. Let's create a positive vision that attracts people, that's about family and community and raising, good kids and building good structures and, prosperity and mutual benefit. And that is a thing that I think a lot of people can get around.
Yes.
And it brings like the good quality people around, right? Like the people who want to build something. They don't want to get like no one who's smart is kind of celebrating the fact that we have to do this.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think, no, I agree. And I think, we're both doing it in our own ways, right? And I think one of the things, I like that terminology you use, like be the guy. And the reality, and it's funny, it's like I've always kind of, in my life, I've kind of naturally been that position where it's like I'm the one always pulling people together. I'm the one throwing parties, doing the events. You know what I mean? It's just like a natural thing. I'm like, wow, it's good. It's just who I am. And so I think that like really that resonates me at a very deep level. And I think the reality, what you learn, it's like how anything is structured, right? It's like, it's not mass amounts of people doing this. You got to find the people already doing it. It's usually a small number of people. And then you got to kind of build it out underneath them. And I wanted to ask you one last question, then we can do a quick, we'll do a little rapid fire to wrap up. And this is more just for the audience to like understand, why focus on, you use the term fraternal networks, and obviously you're working predominantly working with men. Why? Why the focus on men?
Yeah, I mean, it's not so much that like I would turn down, working with women or anything like that. It's just when I've like the people who just tend to be attracted to these kinds of things, right? Who want to do these kinds of things, like they're primarily guys. I also think that my experience is like I focus on truth so that you can be practical, so that you can get things done, right? And I think one of the many lies of the mainstream delusion, right, this kind of delusional, utopianist, consumerist kind of ideology that gets pushed in the mainstream is that men and women are the same, right? It's just like, no, we're different. We have different, proclivities and desires and stuff like that. I mean, a big part of this to me is that, there's arguments online where, man, there's just like the last couple of days, especially, there's been a lot of these people being like, oh man, liberal white women are the worst. They're the bane of society and they're destroying everything. And I'm just like, why are you hating on like the women, the American women in your country? Like you're being lied to.
Yes.
That that women are like the enemy. It's like, I think, my general take is that men need to be better leaders. And it's a difficult situation in the sense that I think a lot of men don't feel like they have the authority to be a leader, and so the response that I have to that is, well, you kind of have to exercise soft power. And this is like a big, in recruiting, it's like, oh, you're working for a hiring manager. You're not the hiring manager's boss, but you need them to get to do things, right? And so how can you do that in a way that you can kind of bring them along? And I think that's kind of the situation that we're in now, is like redefining what healthy leadership looks like, servant leadership, stewardship, like healthy relationships and stuff like that. So for me, the fraternal network stuff is just, it's kind of how things shake out to be. Is like, it is, like a bunch of guys, and it's a guys club, and yes, we're going to do the smoking the cigars, and we're going to have the steaks and do all that kind of stuff. But if we got an application from a girl who's like, hey, I really care about this, and this is meaningful to me, and especially if she's a mother, like a lot of the guys in our group, probably 50-50 have like families and kids and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Right. And, I meet a lot of great women who are like, work hard. They're usually a little bit more on, they're all kind of like naturally like doing PA stuff or like socializing or whatever. Like they have their domain that they're doing that stuff. And this is a little bit more like, kind of that broader level focus stuff. But yeah, so I guess, I wouldn't be, it's not like intentionally exclusive, right? Nor is it gated by any other factor, we'll say.
Sure, of course.
For me, again, it's about being practical and people who want to build. It ends up being that fraternal networks seem to be kind of the best way to characterize that.
Cool. All right, ready for a little rapid fire?
Go for it.
If you could rebuild one social institution from scratch, which one?
I think everything comes down to education. So it would probably be the education system. I'll elaborate a little bit quicker on that by saying that when I started writing stuff before the MetaPrime project, and a lot of that was running into the online business, or being in the business world, there was a lot of things that I started to learn that I was like, no one ever told me this. Like the first step of solving a problem is understanding the problem. Right? Like no one sat me down and really drilled that concept in a very simplistic, easy way into my head, or stuff like, hey, sometimes when you're considering a problem, you need to consider, is this even the problem that I should be solving? So I call these meta theories, meta strategies, right? And it's like, why don't we have that as kind of why don't we just have a baseline of all the most basic, simple, straightforward
things that are broadly practical. So I think things like that would be immensely helpful, and education would be my answer there.
Most misunderstood idea in your writing?
That's tough because I feel like a lot of the people who read my stuff kind of already get it. They're looking for a way to define it. I'd say if there's any one thing that I do have, like one good mutual, this guy Yukimaru, and he's doing some interesting stuff himself, but he argues with me on this dimension of like, he thinks online fraternal networks are the end all be all and no one should do anything else. So we talk a little bit about like the value of people doing a range of different things and prioritizing and exclusivity. So I think it's, if anything, the thing that people argue the most about when it comes to my writing is more of like the nuance. And I'm much more of like a generalist, give people tools, encourage them to do a range of things, where if there is a pushback, it's usually like, this specific thing is actually the best, and we need to encourage everyone to do that.
Strongest sign someone has healthy social structure in their life?
So, all right. So there's a little weird that I watched this movie that's like an old early 2000 movie. It's called How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days.
Yeah, Matthew McConaughey.
I think everyone's seen this. It's kind of like a chick flick classic, whatever. And I forget exactly why. I was like, somebody had mentioned it, and I was like browsing Netflix, and I was kind of bored one night, so I ended up watching it, right? And like, yeah, it's just cliche, and it's got some, the normal things. But the reason I bring it up is like the scene in which she actually falls for him, right? Is he takes her to go visit his family, and he walks in, and the house is alive. It's like his sister and her husband are there, and their kids are running around, and he has a great relationship with like his parents, and and they're like out having fun, and they're like a cohesive family, and they have all these inside jokes, and he's clearly like loved by the family. He's like taking care of the kids, and so for me, it's that idea of social proof. Like if you go and you meet someone, or you're hanging out with someone in a community, and the people around them, the people in their life, like see them as someone that they love, they interact with, they have these good relationships. Like to me, like that's the thing, is like, who are the friends around you? How do you relate to them? How do they relate to you? Like if that cohesion is strong, I think that like everyone finds that admirable.
One historical figure who deeply understood social structure?
Oh man. I mean, this is a little bit tough for me because I'm not like a read old books, look up to historical figures kind of guy.
Or someone that just influenced your work, someone that's just like really influenced you, other people that you read or something.
So when I was in college, I studied network sociology, which was like a rising field. I was right around the time Facebook was getting big and all this kind of stuff. And so I was really interested in that. There's this whole prisoner's dilemma thing. And I really love that stuff. I completely go off on it. But the main professor who was writing and kind of coined the term network sociology was this guy, Duncan Watts from the University of Columbia. He wrote like the 5 degrees. He wrote like the second version of 5 degrees of separation. But his paper, which he published with a few other guys, was called The Strength of Weak Ties. The most cited paper in all of academia by like a factor of 3, like over Einstein or anyone else, right? It's a huge, huge paper. But for whatever reason, I kind of like got into his stuff. And the same with like Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone. Like, so if there's anyone who kind of influenced me early on, like maybe it was actually Duncan Watts, which is like a weird thing to say. He's just like very like, corner case dude. But yeah, if anyone's ever interested in kind of learning about the science of network sociology, like networks, like Duncan Watts has some really good stuff.
Cool. Finish this sentence. America will be strong again when
we rebuild the social fabric.
Where can people find you? Yeah, how can they reach out to you?
Yeah, so I'm on X. There's MetaPrime001. I'll post a lot about the networking stuff, and people will reply, and that's always great. So DMs are open. Go find and follow me on X if that's kind of your jam. I have the Substack. It's the same thing, MetaPrime001. And I have a website, metaprime001.com. And so we've got an application form there if you're interested in joining the MetaPrime network or the Meta network. Fill out the application, send it over. We just do like
like a call and just kind of chat about what people are doing, what they're interested in. And yeah, and then we do have I have a YouTube, but like, all the podcasts goes up through Substack. I think it also pushes Spotify and all the normal stuff. The Metacast is the podcast. So, but yeah, X is where I hang out, and then the website has everything else.
Great. Well, thanks, my man. I appreciate it. And happy New Year once again. And I look forward. Maybe we'll do another one after the next article comes out, because I think there'll be a lot of stuff to dive in there.
No, this is an absolute blast. Thanks for bringing me on. I mean, it's exciting to hear about what you're doing as well. And look forward to. I'm sure this will not be the last time we're collaborating on stuff.
Cool. Thanks, man. Hey, my friends, Jordan here. First and foremost, a sincere thank you and appreciation for all of our early listeners, readers, and supporters at Going Direct. It's really what keeps me going to do this each and every week, because there's clearly a community of folks out there looking to build a Going Direct economy, which gets me super excited. Secondly, if you haven't subscribed, please do so. Our main channel and community is forming over on Substack. The link is in the show notes below. And we'll also be putting out our weekly conversations at YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. I hope you all have a great day, and remember to go direct. 3, 2, 1,